Thank you very much for joining the first session of Let Us Read Ambedkar online 10 lecture series. We are witnessing the people and the countries fighting the COVID-19 pandemic by locking inside and social distancing. Some sections of the working class are privileged to work from home. Ambedkar King Study Circle would like to utilize this period to sharpen understanding of Ambedkar and his writings. And another contradiction to this, the COVID-19 pandemic will be fought and is being fought with the social distancing. But the annihilation of caste is completely contradiction to it, that people have to come to street and they have to come out of home to find it. As far as the session is concerned, it is not only the most of us are interested to know and understand Ambedkar's position on social, political, economic, cultural, and religion, but also imperative for the activists on the ground to get the edge of Ambedkar to build a society to be based on liberty, equality, and fraternity as he dreamed. I'd like to give one parallel that about Ambedkar writings, then we will get into the lecture. Dr. Anand Teltumde wrote that Ambedkar is like a laser beam and people selectively take the range of spectrum according to their social and class position. I think the statement is very true and important, which is made by Dr. Anand. Dr. Ambedkar is the first scholar in India who theorized the solution for the annihilation of caste in totality. Before that, there are so many reformers and worked on a selective areas. But Ambedkar theorized in totality. He proposed a multi-pronged solution which spread across political, economic, social, religious, and cultural. Sometimes most of us have taken him partially, as Dr. Anand says, that a selective spectrum of laser beam. We see such lectures, this online lecture as an opportunity. A, getting the holistic view of Dr. Ambedkar's writing. B, understanding his position on various things such as nationalism, religion, constitutionalism, capitalism, socialism, etc., etc. And C, this online discussion will be helpful for the people across the world to exchange their ideas to sharpen. So that is very much needed at this time, because there are a lot of differences, I won't say, but there is a lot of doubts and clarification that we have to get clarified with each other, and such lectures will be useful. So now I would like to request Dr. Geetha to start the lecture. And also I'd like to thank her once again on behalf of Ambedkar King Study Circle.
Thank you, Karthi, very much, and the Ambedkar King Study Circle from the Bay Area. I'm very glad to be meeting all of you. It's evening for some of you and morning for many of us here in India. I think that speaking of Dr. Ambedkar's life and work at this moment in time can be a source of great hope and nourishment, because I think throughout his life, when he was up against insurmountable challenges, or what seemed like insurmountable challenges, he never allowed himself to become bitter or cynical, and till the very end sustained hope in the possibility of a good and just society. So I think it's extremely appropriate that we are actually talking about Dr. Ambedkar today. And it's very, very important that we see him in the context of world leaders like Martin Luther King, who fought against racial discrimination and for a just economic and cultural universe for all peoples, irrespective of race. So thank you very much again, Ambedkar King Study Circle. So as you perhaps know from the note I had circulated, this class comprises 10 sessions, and I will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will take questions. So the first lecture is actually a sort of broad description of Ambedkar's historical time and context. I would like to sort of place him in the context of the late 19th century, what we call the late colonial period, starting from the last quarter of the 19th century, and sort of link him up with his contemporaries in ways that will help us understand what did he inherit and what did he take forward, and where was he absolutely new and startling in the directions that he pursued. So let me start with the question, what does it mean to read Ambedkar? At one level, it might seem very simple because his collected writings are available online in almost all the Indian languages that one is familiar with, In Tamil, at least, they've all been translated. All the English texts have been translated. And I'm sure in other Indian languages as well. So one might wonder, why would one need to really read them in any particular manner? One can read them whenever one has time, whenever one needs to sort of look up some things and so on. But perhaps we should keep in mind that what we have in English comprises a substantial part of his writings, but there's an equally important body of his writings in Marathi, of which we know very little, especially the editorials he wrote in all the three newspapers he edited, Muknayak, Bahishkrit Bharat, and Janata. Some of this has been translated. There's also a lot of writing on Ambedkar in Marathi, which began during his own lifetime and which continues, and which sort of has built a very enviable and rich body of scholarship, which non-Marathis cannot yet hope to access. So keeping that in mind, that we are reading Ambedkar within a context of his English writings, let's sort of go ahead and understand what does it mean to read Ambedkar. So one of the things I would like us to keep in mind is that Ambedkar's writings, as they have come down to us in English, belong to different contexts and conjunctures. And they comprise many different kinds of texts. So you have speeches he made in public forums, speeches he made in the Bombay legislature in the colonial period, speeches that he made in the Constituent Assembly, and later on in Free India's parliament. So those belong to one category. Then you have his written and oral submissions, which were presented to various commissions set up by the colonial government whenever they wished to discuss and refine political reform in India. So those constitute a large section of his writings. Submissions before the Southborough Commission, the Simon Commission, and at the three roundtable conferences. Then, of course, all the submissions he made to various viceroys on the eve of what is known as the transfer of power from British India to India, to Indian hands, and those also come under this category. Then apart from that, there were those invited addresses, speeches that he was asked to give, say, for example, at the Servants of India Society, or he was invited by the Jatpat Todak Mandal, which then resulted in his most famous text, The Annihilation of Caste, which was never delivered, but which we have now. Then there is, of course, all his research writings, some of which was published in his own lifetime, but a lot of which was put together subsequently. Now, because of the range of his writings, one might imagine that there's a range of voices and ideas. This is not untrue, but there's also immense consistency in Ambedkar's writings, just as there are subtle differences also. And therefore, a reading of Ambedkar helps us to understand how did he articulate and re-articulate a certain idea. Therefore, it's important to read him in context. When did he say what, and why did he say what he did? So that's point number one. The second thing is, it's useful to know who was he responding to. Because even say, take an essay like his famous essay on the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna and his Gita. Now, the Bhagavad Gita was read by almost all important Indian public thinkers and leaders, starting from Ambedkar's own colleague from Maharashtra, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and then Telang and many others. And for those of us who've read Krishna and his Gita, it's quite evident that Ambedkar was looking at a body of scholarship comprising his own Marathi-speaking contemporaries. Tilak's Gita Rahasya was a very, very well-known and highly influential text. So Ambedkar was also responding to other texts that were part of his social and cultural milieu. So it's very useful to place him in the context of his contemporaries, writers and thinkers. The second thing is, of course, that if you place him in conversation with his contemporaries, you see where he agreed with them, where he moved away, where even if he agreed with them, he went on to do something completely different with the ideas that he found compelling and affirming. So for example, if you take someone like Dharmananda Kosambi, one of the early converts to Buddhism in modern India, So Ambedkar was sort of influenced by some of Kosambi's writings, particularly Kosambi's book on Ahimsa and his play called Bodhisattva. And you have elements from both these texts in his Buddha and his Dhamma. But Ambedkar did something totally different from the ideas that he picked up from Kosambi, because he came to these ideas as a state builder, as a practical democrat, and as someone who felt that we need a completely different ethical framework in the Indian context to be able to live together in a just, fraternal, and equal manner. Then, of course, Ambedkar said many things throughout his life, some of which might appear contradictory. So, for all the immense labor that he put in the Constituent Assembly, we all know that he also said that he was merely a hack writer and that if he could, he would burn the Constitution. So, now how are we to make sense of a statement like that? So, it's important, therefore, to see it in context. For all the time that he put in, why did he feel disillusioned? Or was he really feeling disillusioned, or was he pointing to something in the Constitution that we need to pay greater attention to? So that's important as well. Then the other thing is, if you read him carefully, you realize that he continues to use certain phrases, certain ideas throughout his writing career, writing life, so to speak. So for example, if you look at his descriptions of untouchability, they are fascinating, they are brilliant, and they are deeply moving. So if you start with an early statement like we have in submissions to the Southborough Commission, you will see him describe the so-called untouchable as someone whose very persona has been confiscated, which is a very powerful statement and comparable to some of the things we hear in the African American context from writers like, say, James Baldwin, for example. Then you see him using certain other phrases, like in a submission to the Lothian Commission, he says that the untouchable is seen as generating social odium. That's another very powerful statement, but there's a subtle shift here because he's not describing the experience of the untouchable, but the experience of the touchable perpetrator who experiences social odium. So he puts the spotlight on the perpetrator. So it's interesting to follow his writings through the very important and specific phrases that he used throughout his life. So that way we can build what I would like to call word clusters, put together all his key words that belong to a certain idea, belong to a certain form of expression. And then we see how he was actually creating what one might call a new form of knowledge, which will help us annihilate caste and put an end to untouchability. Then, of course, the other thing that I would like to say before I move on to a historical description of his time is the way that he uses words for which we think we know the meaning. For example, the word class. Now, for those of us who are familiar with the literature in Marxism, we are likely to associate the word class with the way it is used in Marxist writing. But in Ambedkar's writings, the word class has many meanings. It means something in a sociological sense, something else in the context of his historical writings, and it means what the Marxists make it mean when he's addressing the Indian left. So we'll have to pay very careful attention to how he uses words. Now, of course, all these usages are connected, but it helps to know when he was using what. So, for example, when he uses the word class in his essay on philosophy of Hinduism or the Hindu social order, he uses it to mean the word varna. But when he's addressing the Indian left, he uses it to mean class in, as we understand it in the Marxist context, as a production relationship. And then he also plays with language in very, very interesting ways. And that's also something we need to be very alert to. So at one point in his Marathi writings, when he's addressing the Indian left, he says, it's all very well to talk of proletarian unity, but how can you have proletarian unity when the proletariat is divided along the lines of religion and caste? And there he uses in a very interesting way, he uses the Marxist idea of base and superstructure. So he tells the Marxists, you're trying to build the superstructure without really attending to the base, which in this context is not really the economic base, but the base which is caste and religion. So he plays with categories that he's received from other contexts in a very kind of interesting way. So therefore, I think reading Ambedkar in a manner that looks at his context, who he was speaking to, who he was addressing, helps us to establish the nature of knowledge that he was generating, and a lot of which is unparalleled and something which we have not really fully grasped and which we have been trying to grasp for a very long time. So this brings me to the whole question of, so what does it mean to read Ambedkar today? And here we have to remember that Ambedkar has always been read by the very large Dalit constituency that has remained loyal to him, that has preserved his memory, that has created a repository of ideas, and which has sustained his heritage through practical acts, through acts of thought, in literature, in culture. And he has also been sort of preserved in the memory of various other anti-caste movements. For example, in the self-respect movement in the Tamil Nadu context, for example, if you take a journal such as Revolt, which was the only English journal that the Tamil self-respecters started, you would find several references to Dr. Ambedkar's work in the Bombay province during that period. So there have been movements and ideas and thinkers who have kept alive Dr. Ambedkar's legacy. But sad to say, in mainstream India, as well as in our academic context, we have not really seriously and consistently engaged with him until Dalit Bahujan scholars made it clear that not to engage with Ambedkar is not to understand the social realities of India. And I think their presence in our universities, their scholarship has forced our hand in some ways. And so over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a sustained and greater interest in Ambedkar's thought. Now, the second reason why I think we need to be engaged with Dr. Ambedkar's thought is also because of the challenges we face in India and across the world. Neither development as it is understood, nor the growth of modern communication technologies, nor the fact that we are truly global today in a sort of virtual sense, has helped eradicate caste feeling, hatred, what Ambedkar described as social odium towards the so-called untouchables, and the sense of difference and discrimination. We all know there are communities on the internet that are given over to hatred. In India, there's an entire political formation committed to hatred of those who are considered low in the caste order, of the so-called untouchables, of ethnic and religious minorities. In short, of anybody who's different from how the dominant upper caste Hindu likes to think of himself or herself. So I think Ambedkar's legacy is more important than ever. Secondly, given the crisis we are in across the world, a crisis of democracy, how do we retain faith in democracy? Given the fact that the communist parties across the world, that socialism across the world has long been in crisis, how do we sort of nurture, expand, and deepen the meanings of socialism in various contexts? And given the fact that gender discrimination and patriarchies are nowhere near to being gone. And in India, we've seen the phenomenon of terrible violence against those who transgress caste boundaries, especially in terms of love and conjugality, and violence against those who prefer different sexual and gendered identities, who do not want to fit into compulsory heteronormative, heterosexual context, the immense violence against them, the need for fraternity, for what Dr. Ambedkar called Maitri, using the language of the Buddha, appears more important than ever. And I think these terms and phrases need to be understood in all their richness, all their complexity. So I think there's a very important case for all of us across the world taking Dr. Ambedkar's thoughts seriously, And today we can happily say that he has truly become a world thinker with scholars from different contexts, from places like, say, Mexico, to Europe, to, of course, India, to Nepal, to Sri Lanka, have shown great interest in his work. So the reasons for reading Ambedkar, I think, clearer than ever before. And so that's the first part of my talk. Now, the second part is, how do we understand him in his own time? And I think this is very useful and interesting because it also helps us to see where he shared common ground with his contemporaries and where he sort of departed from them and where he sort of became a very sort of lone intellectual warrior in some ways. So if you were to sort of look at how was he viewed in his own time, now, there are some very fascinating texts that help us do it. One is, of course, the reminiscences of the Dr. Ambedkar, which were put together by his secretary, Rattu, and which has since been found in several volumes, including in the more recent English volume, Ambedkar, The Attendant Details, which was translated into Tamil called Baba Saheb Karigirindi. And you see how he was adored, respected, listened to carefully by an entire generation of young and older Dalits in his own time, and by several others who were not Dalits but who were committed to the annihilation of caste. You also know that he was respected as a formidable intellectual by his contemporaries, again, not just by Dalits but by several others. His writings were read, though not everybody agreed with what he was saying. And we know from his own remarks and thoughts on Pakistan that his work on Pakistan was read both by the Congress and the Muslim League leaders. Then there was praise for his work from very diverse quarters, from Jinnah, for example, to Rajni Parmedat, who was a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, from Periyar to M. N. Roy. So he enjoyed the respect of his contemporaries a great deal. But equally, he was reviled, he was criticized, he was considered by some, especially in the nationalist movement and in the Indian left, as being pro-imperialist and reactionary. He was called communal because he demanded separate electorates for Dalits. And there were those that wanted to injure him, to harm him, physically even, during the discussions leading to the Pune Pact. So there was that as well. Then, of course, he was reluctantly admired. People who didn't agree with him, but who couldn't also ignore him. And this you see in the Constituent Assembly. And there you find people giving him left-handed compliments. And for me, the most ironic and very unfair compliment is when people refer to him as the Manu of modern India, which is very unfortunate because throughout his life, Ambedkar was very critical of the Manusmriti and of all of its content. So to sort of call him the Manu of modern India was a way of saying he knows his legal literature and so on, but they were not quite sure what to make of his formidable intellect. So you have those kinds of reluctant admirers as well. That's one part of how Ambedkar was viewed in his own time. The second part is, how do we place him in the context of late colonial India and early independent India? And here I would like us to sort of address the whole tradition of thought that evolved in late colonial India, to which we have begun to pay attention only again, I think, over the last quarter century, at least in a scholarly sense, or say the last 30 years, which is what I would call the anti-caste radical tradition. Now, colonial India, late colonial India gave rise to many traditions of thought, and the two traditions that many of us are familiar with from our history textbooks are the nationalist tradition and the communist tradition. There was also an equally important tradition, which I think may be traced back to Mahatma Phule in Maharashtra, if not earlier, which I would like to call the anti-caste radical tradition, and which viewed liberty and equality not just in terms of freedom from British rule or freedom from economic exploitation, but also freedom from the inequalities of the caste order and the destruction of untouchability. And this tradition, I think, is a very rich, very important modern tradition of thought to which Ambedkar rightfully belongs, though I think he also belongs equally to the vast tradition of national and communist thought that emerged during this period. And we shall see in exactly what ways he also shares ground with these other traditions. But I think he is the greatest and most eloquent exponent of anti-caste radicalism. And there were many people who shared that anti-caste radicalism in his own time. But prior to his time, Mahatma Phule was, of course, the most important example. And following Mahatma Phule in terms of chronology is Pandit Iyothee Thass from Old Madras, from the Madras presidency, who lived and worked in the Tamil-speaking regions of the Madras presidency. I think these two men were the pioneers of anti-caste thought in the late colonial context, and both of them shared considerable common ground. Um, for one, both of them were very critical of nationalism as it had emerged at that point in time. And Phule was very critical of the nationalists. He felt that whatever they demanded from the British by way of freedom or by way of equality, they were not willing to share with the Dalit Bahujans or the Shudras, Adishudras, and women, as he called that constituency. Iyothee Thass was deeply critical of what today we call the extremists amongst the nationalists associated with Tilak and with Bipin Chandra Pal and Lala Lajpat Rai. And he wrote a series of essays called Swadesa Seerthiruttam or Swadeshi Reform in his weekly Tamilan, where he subjected nationalism to extremely consistent and strong critique and posing the very pertinent question, in the country that you imagine, where will Dalits find a place? Will the so-called Cheri be part of the nation? It's a question that Dalit intellectuals and activists continue to ask. So that is a very important critique of nationalism. What place will the oppressed castes and the Dalits find in this so-called nation? Will the nationalists address questions of inequality and questions of lack of freedom for Dalits and the oppressed castes within the larger Indian social order? The second thing in which Phule and Iyothee Thass were very important were the way they made use of the new knowledges that were available to them in the colonial period. Phule has written about this. He owed a great deal to the rationalist critique of religion, which came to India through the writings of Thomas Paine and many other radicals, and through missionary criticisms of Hinduism as it was understood at that time. But Iyothee Thass, while he did not sort of claim the rationalist tradition, you see that he was very aware of the different ways in which Brahminical thought, especially Brahminical Hinduism and the Hindu religious texts, the Puranas and the Itihasas, had been sharply criticized by the missionaries and by a generation of Buddhist scholars of Buddhism who were active in his own time. And he placed himself in the line of this Buddhist criticism of Brahminical thought. And he went on to, of course, argue that the Dalits were the original Buddhists of not just the Tamil-speaking regions, but of all of India. So rational thought on the one hand, and the rediscovery of Buddhism as an important civilizational force in the history of the Indian subcontinent, on the other hand, these helped Phule and Iyothee Thass to mount a critique of Brahminical thought, of Brahminical Hinduism, of the role of Brahminical intellectuals and ideology in the Hindu social context, and to call to attention the role of the Brahmin intellectual in sustaining these very oppressive ideologies. So both of them were very similar. They were, of course, very different because Phule created something called the Truth-Seeking Society or the Satyashodak Samaj, which, of course, might reference Buddhism, but which was not Buddhist. Whereas Iyothee Thass went on to convert to Buddhism and created a new Buddhist formation called the Sakya Bauddha Sangam. So those two men are very important figures in colonial India, and Ambedkar's writings and thought owe a great deal to what Phule had to say about colonialism, about caste, about Brahminism. Ambedkar, of course, did not agree with everything that Phule had to say. For example, he did not agree that Brahminical Hinduism needs to be thought of in terms of an Aryan invasion. Ambedkar did not really favor the Aryan theory of caste, the theory that caste was an Aryan imposition, which theory Iyothee has also upheld, and which a certain first generation of Dalit intellectuals also subscribed to, and they were influenced by Phule's way and the Satyashodak Samaj's way of looking at things. And certain other early Dalit movements, including the Adharm movement in the United Provinces of what is now Uttar Pradesh and parts of the Punjab, or the Adi Hindu movement associated with Swami Achyutanand. These movements also subscribed to a racial view of caste. Ambedkar did not agree with these views, though he respected their founders for the anti-caste work that they all did. So he really belongs to this tradition, but he also took this tradition forward in very, very complex ways. And we will, of course, see what he did with these ideas when we look at different aspects of his thought. Now, one other thing that I think we need to understand is how Ambedkar um, and the anti-caste tradition was truly universal. And what do I mean by that? So, if you look at the thought of Mahatma Phule, you will see that when he talks of inequality, when he talks of the Shudras, Adi Shudras, and women, he draws comparison with the plight of people who have been enslaved in other parts of the world. So for him, the comparable communities to Shudra, Ati Shudra, and women are those that are called the Aboriginals in Australia today and the Native Americans. And he says, just as they were put to utter misery by the colonizers, Shudra, Adi Shudras, and women were put to miseries by the Aryan colonizers. So he was sort of gesturing towards a world historical community of oppressed peoples. This is what Phule does. Interestingly, Iyothee also does that when he talks of how people across the world share a common culture of labor. So when he's sort of explaining the Tamil concept of the five landscapes, the Thinais, he talks of how agriculturalists, wherever they are in the world, whether they are in India or America or Ethiopia, he also references Africa, and he says they all are laborers who produce the wealth of food. So he also places workers within this world culture of laborers who create wealth and food and many other things that sustain civilization. Now, Ambedkar, as you know, tried to understand untouchability and the caste order through evoking a number of historical global examples from Roman slavery to African American slavery of the African Americans in the United States, and later on in the 1940s to the plight of the Jews under the Nazis and under fascism, and to the experiences of Africans under colonialism. This is something that he does as early as the 1920s. So the anti-caste radical traditions viewed the plight of Bahujan Dalits and in some cases women in terms of a world historical oppression practiced by white colonizers, imperialism, and capitalism. And interestingly, many Dalits who migrated to other parts of the world, either as laborers or in search of work, also came back to enrich our political traditions. So if you look at the people that came back and joined the Ghadar movement, the left party that was founded in the Bay Area in the United States, many of whom came back to India to join the Indian struggle for independence. Some amongst them were Dalits who had been part of the Ghadar movement and then who came on to become part of the anti-caste and in some cases the communist movements in Punjab and Western Uttar Pradesh. Then, of course, you have someone like Rettamalai Srinivasan from the Tamil Nadu context, who, along with Ambedkar, participated in the first roundtable conference. He had traveled widely, including in West Asia and Africa, and he was also a world traveler, and he brought that experience to fighting caste and asking for better terms for Dalits within colonial society. And sometimes you have travelers who went from the Indian context to other places and enriched politics in those places. And again, those many of them were Dalits. So you have someone like Bernard Sigamani, whose family was originally from northern Tamil Nadu, from Vellore district today, who went to South Africa. His parents were Dalit Catholics, Dalit Christians. And Bernard Sigamani went on to be part of the anti-apartheid movement. He was one of the South African members of the International Workers of the World, or the Wobblies. So you have this Dalit universalism also emerging in and through Dalit migrant laborers or Dalit migrants who went to different parts of the world. So what I mean to sort of point out is that there is this very rich universalism that Dalit workers and Dalit thinkers and anti-caste Bahujan workers and thinkers also brought into various contexts. And here we mustn't forget, for our Tamil audience especially, this would be of great interest, the number of Tamils who went overseas to Malaysia or Burma or to Singapore and who went on to join very important political groups. I mean, a number of Tamils joined the Malaysian Communist Party, for example, some of whom came back during World War II and joined the Indian Communist movement. And many of them were as committed to an anti-caste struggle as they were to an anti-capitalist struggle. So it is in this context that I would like to place Dr. Ambedkar's life and work, his very vast and complex history of anti-caste radicalism. And he, of course, belongs very much also to the very specific tradition in Maharashtra, going back to Phule, but equally to a tradition that he himself admired, though he differed from them considerably, a tradition of social reform advanced by upper caste reformers, people like Gopal Hari Deshmukh, Mahadev Ranade, by Agarkar, and in a very different sense by Bahujans such as Shahu Maharaj, Vittal Rao Shinde, and also by that very important Raja of Baroda, Sayaji Gaikwad, with whose support Ambedkar went to study in Columbia. All of them were critics of Brahminical thought, of Brahminical Hinduism, and many of them supported the annihilation of caste in their own fashion. The Brahmin reformers were less vocal and less vociferous, but they were very sensitive to the importance of social reform. And this is something that Ambedkar would talk about later on, and we will, of course, read that essay, Ranade, Jinnah, and Gandhi, later on in this class. So that tradition of social reform, Ambedkar felt was very important because it addressed issues of what was wrong with the Hindu social order, or not just with what was wrong with imperialism and capitalism. So I think he respected that tradition while disagreeing with it in some ways. He felt that the reformers hadn't gone far enough. But then certain proponents of reform, like Shahu Maharaj, were radical proponents. Shahu Maharaj was one of the first people to introduce what we call reservation or positive discrimination in his own kingdom. He was one of the first to insist that interdining with Dalits was very important. He opened up government offices to Dalits and Bahujans in his kingdom. He also passed laws for women's rights, including a law which today we would say would be a law against domestic violence. So this tradition also is something that I think Ambedkar should be seen as being part of. So to conclude today's lecture, I want us to sort of think through the importance of reading Ambedkar carefully, systematically, in terms of historical context, paying attention to his texts, with the knowledge that we still don't have access to all of his writings. And we need to read him because we need him today to deal with the crises and challenges we face with respect to politically progressive systems, including democracy and socialism, and because caste and race persist in ever uglier forms than before. And we need to read him in the context of his time so that we can see what he shared with those times and where he parted from his contemporaries and went on to do something that was startlingly original and radical. So I'll end my presentation and we can take questions. You must give me a few minutes to sort of take a sip of water. Thank you very much for listening, and the floor is open for discussions.